4 conference. So I am pleased to announce that Kaitlin Urso, Colorado, is willing and able to present on
program. Give me a call or come to your home in your office.
Please mute yourselves.
Bye-bye.
Yes, if everyone who's not going to be talking up front would mute themselves, and toward the end of the presentation, and Kaitlin will give the cue, we'll do a Q&A. That way we won't have any distracting noises. Thank you for your cooperation. Again, Mark Stoddard with Indiana, the other SBEAP technical committee member. I'd like to welcome Kaitlin Urso, who's going to be talking about providing proactive environmental assistance to the cannabis industry. She has a lot of experience. Some of you may have participated in one of the annual conferences where she talked about sustainable brewing. Now she's going to bring her vast wealth of knowledge on the cannabis environmental spectrum regarding environmental assistance. So I'm looking forward to this. I have a lot to learn, and I'm excited because I got to witness a bit of a preview. And with that, Kaitlin, go ahead. Take it away.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you all for having me. I'm excited to talk to you about, the latest industry that I'm working with. It's a pretty big industry here in Colorado, and that's cannabis. When I say cannabis, I mean both hemp and marijuana. We'll be covering both, so it's a pretty relevant topic to all states since hemp is federally legalized and is available in all states, and a lot of the environmental impacts of the marijuana industry cross over to the hemp industry, and we can kind of talk about that. But when I say cannabis, just know that I mean both hemp and marijuana, unless I'm specifically talking about one or the other. So the slides I provided for you guys today were actually a recycled slide deck from a recent presentation that I did for the Colorado Environmental Health Association. So you guys know what I do because you guys all have the same job as me and are very aware of what the Small Business Assistance Program does. So I'll skip that slide. Types of businesses I help, similar to all of you, just any small business in Colorado, 100 employees or less. As Mark mentioned at the beginning, my industry focus that I typically specialize in are craft brewing and cannabis. Those are 2 large industries of growth here in Colorado. This went backwards. Forward. There we go. All right, so first let's talk about, just laying out overall the environmental impacts of the cannabis industry, and then I'll kind of, go into more detail. But at the high level, I like to break the cannabis industry into two main components. There's cultivation and then there's processing. So for cultivation, it's worth noting that in Colorado, almost all marijuana is grown indoors versus almost all hemp is grown outdoors. Now there's exceptions to the rule for both, but that's primarily how it's done. The marijuana industry, there's a lot of energy usage for the lighting. Having all these artificial lights in a cultivation environment creates a lot of heat. Those lights put off a lot of heat. So in turn, these places need a lot of HVAC. I mean, we are air conditioning warehouses in the winter time to keep up with the heat loads of these lights and also the plants, transpiring humidity and things like that. So humidity are the biggest drivers for energy within indoor cultivation. There's also water treatment and irrigation. So these indoor facilities are relying on our municipal drinking water system for their water supply. But that being said, these facilities are typically providing an additional level of treatment to the water before they're serving it to their plants. So commonly they'll carbon filter it. They may put it through a UV light. We have commonly seen reverse osmosis systems installed, which we really try to discourage because we have pretty good drinking water quality, water supply to begin with. And then when you're treating it with RO, you're just further stripping the water of any natural nutrients that honestly they end up then adding back in to support the life of the plants. And so it can be 50% wastewater right off the bat with an RO system, so we don't really encourage those. There's also irrigation systems with the facility to water all of the plants. And then you have a wastewater effluent, and that effluent is going to be loaded with, all the nutrients that they feed to the plants, any pesticides that they treat the plants with, things like that. So the wastewater effluent can be unique. There's a lot of plant waste, obviously, from the process. So organic waste, there's universal waste and hazardous waste. So they have, typical trash, they've got lighting, they've got hazardous waste with solvents, which I'll talk about more in a little bit. And then there's also air emissions, which people don't really think about. And so as the plants grow, they naturally emit terpenes. That's what's associated with the strong marijuana smell. You're smelling the terpenes of the plants. Well, those are VOCs. And so we want to study what is this new industry's impact on ozone formation in the Colorado non-attainment area, because we are non-attainment for ozone basically in the heart of our city center, and that's also where all of our indoor marijuana is grown. All right, so environmental impacts of product processing. Now these impacts apply to both hemp and to marijuana. The same product processing that they do for marijuana products to create concentrates is the same process they're doing on hemp to create CBD concentrates. And so what they're basically doing is washing the plant material, whether it's hemp or marijuana, with solvent to extract those cannabinoids, whether it's CBD or THC. And so in these pictures here, these are pictures of the types of equipment that they use. And so those two metal cylinders, those actually with plant material, and then pressurized solvent, in those tanks to wash the plant material. So it's going to be, the typical solvents are ethanol, propane, butane are the most popular. Some of the less popular solvents are heptane and pentane, and those are for the marijuana industry. They're very restricted on what solvents they can use. However, for the hemp industry, there's no regulation. They can use whatever the heck they want, including hexane. We have seen facilities using large quantities of hexane for these types of extraction, which hexane is a hazardous air pollutant and is going to trigger air quality regulations at a much lower level than, say, ethanol or propane or butane. So just keep those in mind. We are seeing pressurized CO2 used for extraction as well. So we don't see solvent releases from that, but we see CO2 releases. Also, they use a lot of cleaning products, primarily isopropyl alcohol, to clean up after this activity, because the material that they extract is very sticky. It's almost like a molasses, so they have to use a lot of alcohol products to clean the equipment and that thing. And then there's hazardous waste from solvent extraction. That leftover solvent, although these machines are efficient at recovering the solvent, they're a closed loop solvent recovery process, they're only about 70 to 80% efficient overall. And so you're getting 20 to 30% evaporated losses of solvent each run that they do. So yeah, that's interesting. We'll move on. Okay, so I'm primarily going to talk about the air quality impacts from cannabis cultivation and extraction, just because it's a topic that is emerging. Not a lot of people are talking about it. It's where the devil's in the details with the air quality. And then, maybe the last 10 minutes of the presentation or so, I'll touch on energy, water, and waste impacts. But the bulk of the information is going to be on air quality. So we all know that VOCs react with nitrogen oxide and sunlight to form ground level ozone. That's why we care about nitrogen oxide. That's why we care about VOCs. And I'm sure in your states, you guys are doing, all the things that you can to regulate both sources of nitrogen oxide and volatile organic compounds, right? And so with us legalizing cannabis, both marijuana and hemp, Colorado legalized both marijuana and hemp ahead of any federal legalization. We legalized hemp back in July of 2017, and at the federal level, it legalized in December 2018. So we were a little bit ahead on hemp as well. So it's kind of created some inadvertent issues in our state, and I'll go over those. breathing ozone has negative health impacts and is harmful to the environment. It's an oxidant. It oxidizes our lungs. It oxidizes plants. It's bad. We all know that. All right, so the next slide is a map of Colorado. It's an older map. It's from 2017, but it's still pretty relevant. The green stars on the map show all the locations of cannabis cultivations in our state. The green shaded area, kind of, you know, in the center there is our ozone non-attainment area. And then the kind of like orangish shaded areas that have lines through them on the map are our state's identified health equity, environmental justice priority areas. So there's a couple of interesting things to point out on this map. Most of the cultivations in the state are in the non-attainment area, about 60 to 70%. That number is kind of a moving target. But the bulk of the industry is in our city center, and that was directly a result of how we legalized, the way that we zoned, the way that municipalities approved the use of cultivation, things like that. And then also worth noting that about 65% of the industry is also within 1 mile of a health equity environmental justice area, which again comes back to zoning. They were zoned light industrial, and so they're right there co-located next to other industrial sources of pollution, which is really what highlights, you know, the issue and why we're interested in studying it, basically. You know, we want to know, it wouldn't be such a big deal if the way that we legalized marijuana was it had an even distribution in our state, but it doesn't. The bulk of the industry is in our city center, co-located next to our other sources of pollution, right in nitrogen oxide rich areas. So any new source of VOCs is going to readily react to form ozone. So when we have the marijuana in, and center itself in the heart of our ozone non-attainment area, it raises the question of what is their impact on the overall, you know, ozone formation in our state. So that's the question that I'm trying to answer with my research that I'm doing, and I'll talk more about that. But what's worth noting is that VOC emissions from cannabis cultivation are not subject to air quality regulations because it's an agricultural activity, and agricultural activities are exempt from air quality regulations unless they're a major source of air emissions. I don't foresee that happening, but again, another reason to study the impact. So what I'm trying to answer is known of how many VOCs how many pounds of VOCs are emitted from producing a pound of marijuana. EPA typically establishes new emission factors for new businesses that come online, but given the federal legal status of marijuana, they're not going to do that. And so states that have legalized are kind of left answering this question on our own. So here in Colorado, I was able to secure $31,000 in funding to establish a VOC emission factor for cannabis cultivation. So how I conducted the study was at 4 cannabis cultivation facilities that volunteered to participate in the study. This was not a mandatory requirement by any means. It was a voluntary effort with the industry. And so 4 cultivation facilities stepped up and said, you know, we'd like to be a part of the study in quantifying our environmental impact. You're welcome to take samples out of our facility. So we did. We took samples throughout the cultivation process. So clones when they're just little baby plants to when they're in the vegetative stage, they're a little bit smaller, all the way through flowering and harvesting. We took samples also during harvesting and trimming activities, which, you know, interesting to findings there was we saw much higher VOC emission rates from the harvesting and trimming than from the actual cultivation, you know, clone through flowering stage. We saw a lot more VOC emissions were emitted when you start agitating the plants, cutting them up, you know, converting them into other products is where we saw more emissions. We also took pre and post filtration at exhaust points. So a lot of these facilities have carbon filtration in place. So we wanted to look at how effective is that carbon filtration and also look at, you know, what is the overall VOC emission rate of these facilities given all of the activities that they're conducting within their walls. So here's a couple more pictures of the sampling team and our equipment, what we used. So in these pictures are actually from our pilot study, and so in the pictures you can see both a Suma canister and a 10X tube. We ended up going with the tube method, and so you can see, there's a rod in the picture, and at the top of the rod there's a little tube that leads up to just a tiny glass tube. Within that glass tube, that's a hollow glass tube, has some filter media in it, and then in the pump slowly pull air through the tube. The VOCs are captured on the filter media. After we collect the sample, we put caps on either end of the tube and then mail it off to the lab, and they're able to basically pull the VOCs off the filter media. The other method that we tested in our pilot testing was the Suma canisters, and that's that metal looking paint can thing there. So basically it's just a vacuumed out canister. You open a valve in the room, it slowly pulls air into the canister, and that's where you get your air sample. You mail the canister off to the lab, and they vacuum out the air and do their analysis. What we found in the pilot study is that terpenes are super sticky. And with the, what would be the traditional sampling method for this type of sampling, the Suma canister did not work because the terpenes stuck to the outside of the canister in transportation. And so we found much better results from using the 10X tube method, given the sticky nature of these VOCs, of these terpenes, because they actually stuck to the filter media really well and then could be desorbed and separated by mass spectrometry back at the lab. Kind of the methodology that we used is we used PIDs, which give you live concentrations of VOCs in the room, but it's total VOCs and it's not super accurate, but we use those PID devices, set them in any room that we were going to collect tube samples in. We did those devices in the room for a full week so that we could get the peak concentration and the lowest concentration throughout the week. And then we went back and sampled our tube samples at the highest concentration the previous week and the lowest concentration the previous week. So that even though these are, 5 to 20 minute samples that we're collecting, we can use those more accurate results to calibrate the curve of the less accurate PID analyzer to make assumptions about the emissions when we weren't sampling. So we could basically assume full week's worth of data based off of 2 tube samples coupled with the data from the PID. I hope that makes sense. So here's a couple more photos from the sampling study. Just the sheer size of these rooms is kind of awe-striking. Like I said, different stages of the plants. So on the bottom, you can kind of see that they're younger baby plants. Then moving up, you see, tall flowering plants. The picture in the middle is a picture of me with the equipment in a drying room. You can see the full, entire ceiling is hanging marijuana that's drying. And so in that room, I think there was about 450 pounds worth of marijuana drying when we collected that sample. So that's kind of interesting. And then this photo on the side here is actually a video that I'll play for you guys, just to give you an idea of the sheer size of what an indoor cultivation looks like. So here's just a panoramic view of one of the rooms that we sampled in to give you an idea of just how big they can be. That room in particular, I think, had about 2,000 plants in it. So it's pretty big. And that facility in particular had about 10 of these rooms. So a large facility. So the timeline sampling study, January 2018 was when we were awarded funding. September of 2018 was when we were the funds were released and we were allowed to start using them and planning with them and things like that. February of this year is when we conducted, our pilot study, and we sampled, or actually it was last September, and then we started sampling for the actual study February of this year through last month, September year. So we're at the point now where all of our samples have been collected. We're waiting on results from the laboratory to get us our final results. Then September through March of next year, we'll be doing data validation, putting that into our air quality model, working on a write-up, and then we're hoping to publish results by summer of next year is kind of our tentative timeline. So that being said, that's VOC emissions that we're studying from marijuana cultivation, specifically because our state legalized indoors, and like I said before, the bulk of the industry is within our ozone unattainment area, so that's kind of the impetus for the air study. I wanted to point out to you folks too that there's also, could be a potential issue with diesel generators at cannabis cultivation. So whether that's marijuana or hemp, a lot of greenhouse cultivations and a lot of indoor cultivations in rural areas are using emergency generators either for sole or supplemental supply. So a lot of times in rural areas, a new cultivator will get a permit to operate, a license to grow, they get their facility all online, they build it out. They cannot actually request power from the municipality until they have approval to operate. And so they'll get their approval to operate, they'll request grid power, and then sometimes it's 6 months to a year before they can actually get power. In the meantime, they need to operate because they just spent a whole lot of money getting approval to operate. And so they'll run an emergency or a backup generator, generator, 24 hours a day to support their cultivation. So we are getting complaints about hearing about this issue. Also, a lot of cultivations are going to have diesel generators for emergency backup power, because if their power goes down and they lose a crop, they lose a lot of money. And so a lot of them are going to have emergency backup generators that need to be tested, monthly, whatever. And so we've gotten complaints about, an influx of generators supporting the cannabis industry. An interesting thing to note about that is in Colorado, we haven't adopted all of EPA's like NESHAP standards for engines, for instance. And so some of these rules still have federal oversight, but the feds aren't going to do anything to enforce those rules on an operation that they see federally illegal. So it kind of leaves states in an interesting position where we're trying to have enforcement authority of a federal NESHAP that we haven't adopted yet. Not to add a layer of complication. But anyways, moving on to solvents. So the solvents that evaporate VOCs during extraction and cleaning, and again, I mentioned that this can be common to both the marijuana and hemp industry. So if you are a state that doesn't have legal marijuana, guess you still have legal hemp. The hemp industry is booming, and there's two types of commodities, crops grown for the hemp industry. So to back up, the only difference between hemp and marijuana is the federal definition that says that hemp has to be below 0.3% THC content. I was just explaining this to Mark on the phone earlier that, it's the same plant, it's a cannabis plant, it's the same species of plant, it's just the federal government has defined hemp is below 0.3% THC, marijuana is above 0.3 THC percentage. At the end of the day, compare it to growing tomatoes. You're going to grow red tomatoes or you're going to grow yellow tomatoes. It's still a tomato. It's still cannabis. It's the same plant. And then within that, on the hemp side, if you're below 0.3% THC, there's two main commodity markets that the hemp industry is going after. One is industrial fiber use, so supporting like hempcrete, plastics made out of hemp, basically using the industrial fibers for industrial purposes. And then there's kind of the pseudo medical side of it where they're using it for medicinal purposes, but it's doesn't have any medical oversight. And that's the CBD market. Here in Colorado, of the two industries, industrial hemp versus CBD market, we're almost seeing all of our hemp production go to the CBD extraction market because there's large profit margins right now, and we're experiencing a big CBD boom. I think that part of it is lack of regulatory oversight, lack of consumer education, I don't know, a lot of it's perception. I could talk about the hemp industry all day and the dangers of it, but basically know that it does not have the same oversight as the marijuana industry. They're not restricted to what solvents they use. There's end product testing required, like the products that they put out, those CBD, concentrates, they're not required to test residual solvents, any residual pesticides, any heavy metal contaminants, mold, spores, botulism, you name it, they can put it on the shelf with no oversight. So be very careful when you or your loved ones are approaching CBD products. I will leave it at that. Anyways, whether you're making CBD or THC concentrates, there's common solvents that are used, as I mentioned before: propane, butane, ethanol, isopropyl alcohol. Again, the hemp industry can use hexane, anything they want. There's no regulatory oversight. So how we handle this new extraction industry in Colorado, whether it's marijuana, we look at it as a manufacturing industry. Manufacturing industries are subject to air quality regulations, and how we calculate their air emissions is based on a mass balance. Same way we do it for auto body paint shops. We rely on purchase records. How much solvent did you purchase in 1 year minus what's currently in your inventory? We assume that everything else evaporates unless they want to have a detailed conversation that's backed up with data results for other subtractable emissions. For instance, the plant waste a lot of time retains a lot of the solvent. And a lot of times that plant waste is sent out as hazardous waste because it's contaminated with solvent. And so if they can prove to us that their waste stream has consistently has a certain percentage of solvent in it, then we will allow that to subtract that from their air emissions if they can prove it with waste testing. Okay, I mentioned this, but I want to highlight it on the slide. Again, VOC emissions from extraction facilities are subject to air quality regulations. Hemp or marijuana, it doesn't matter. You are taking an agricultural product, the flowers of the plant, and manufacturing it into a different commodity, whether it's a vape cartridge, a concentrate to smoke, an edible to eat, a tincture to ingest. If it's not a raw cannabis flower, either hemp or marijuana, it falls under the manufacturing process definition, and air quality regulations do apply. All right, so what can we do about all these VOCs? Odor control also controls VOCs. So carbon filtration has been used historically for many industries to control VOCs. It's not a surprise that the cannabis industry has adopted carbon filtration for odor control. Very common, especially here in Colorado. We see a lot of facilities that have carbon filters in place and are pretty effective at reducing, the odors and the VOCs. What I tell people is the carbon filters highly dependent on operating conditions on how effective they are. So this 50 to 98% is a wide range, and it's a wide range for a reason because it relies on those operating conditions. So the next slide is about choosing a filter with a high VOC removal efficiency. Next one's super important. Do not exceed the maximum rated flow rate through the filter. As I mentioned before, these facilities are dealing with a really high HVAC load. They're having to overcome the humidity from the plants, the heat from the lighting. It's basically like a mini rainforest that they've created that they have to artificially overcome with their HVAC systems. And so they're pulling really high flow rates through their HVAC systems. Well, if you exceed the maximum rated flow rate through the filter, you're not getting proper contact time for those VOCs to be absorbed into the filter. You're just blowing right through it. Your carbon filter is basically doing nothing. Also, in inspecting on a regular schedule, and it's typical for them to only change out filters maybe once every 6 months, once a year. We just tell them, if you're going to do that, make sure you have a fresh filter in May, the height of, the beginning of ozone season. Ozone season in Colorado is May through September, when the sun is hottest, biggest, brightest. We have the most potential for ozone formation. We want them to have the highest filter efficiency in those critical months versus when it, kind of drops off, efficiency drops off in the winter. It's not as big of a deal. We really recommend having a pre-filter to extend the filter life. There's a lot of, dusts and pollens and things in these cultivation facilities that can take up the space in the carbon filter if you don't have a pre-filter to capture those. So it's worth noting that, odor control options for cannabis are not all created equal. Again, this applies to, when I say cannabis, both hemp and marijuana. Outdoor hemp grows are going to have very similar odor to outdoor marijuana grows. Hemp extractions are going to have very similar odors to marijuana extractions. It's the same plant. It's the same terpene. It's just the cannabinoid content that's different. Hemp is going to have that below 0.3% THC content, but as far as nature's concerned, it's the same plant, it's the same smell, those kinds of things. So when I talk about odor control, it's not all being created equal. Carbon filtration is king. It's the only, you know, physical odor control where we're physically capturing those odors. There's also neutralizing agents out there, and then there's masking and counteractive agents. So neutralizing agents are a chemical spray that's sprayed at, you know, the facility perimeter that actually reacts with the volatile organic compound and renders it no longer available to react with ozone. Many products claim that they're neutralizing agents, but when you get down to like testing the chemistry, they're actually masking or counteractive agents. Masking and counteractive agents are rampant throughout the cannabis industry. It's very common. A masking agent is going to be basically just a stronger smelling VOC. You're going to smell bubblegum or pine or cherry instead of the marijuana smell. And that's just because they're putting out stronger smelling VOCs than the marijuana smell. But from an air pollution standpoint, you're essentially doubling your VOC emissions, right? Counteractive agents are very similar. The only difference is counteractive agents, there's this phenomenon that happens in our olfactory senses, you know, in our nose. When two complementary smells hit our nose at the same time, they paralyze our olfactory senses and make us think we're smelling nothing. When again, we're still just smelling two complementary VOCs together. So again, from an air quality perspective, doubling VOC emissions, not solving the problem, versus carbon filtration is actually capturing that VOC and making it no longer available for the reaction. Important distinctions to make. Common misconceptions in the cannabis industry too. A lot of them think that they are controlling their odors by, you know, spraying pine smelling smell all over their property, and they're like, oh, we fixed the odor issue. Well, you did not fix the air quality impacts because you have the terpenes from the plants, and now you have the terpenes from your masking agent. So when we talk about reducing VOC emissions from the cannabis industry, whether that's cultivation or extraction, it's important because of the impacts on ozone. And us being in an ozone non-attainment area here in Colorado, it's a very high priority for us to bring both VOC emissions and nitrogen oxide emissions down. So the best practices that we recommend for air quality is carbon filtration, obviously. For both cultivation and extraction facilities, if they use it in their extraction facilities, it'll also cut down on the odors. It'll cut down on those those releases of solvents as well. It is worth noting that these extraction facilities, per national fire code, have to follow what's called C1D1 fire code, which is, basically explosion-proof rooms, proper ventilation so solvents can't build up, having a closed-loop solvent recovery system. So some of these things are covered in fire code. However, if your fire district doesn't know what fire code to apply to the industry, it can be a problem. Here in Colorado, I think we have close to 70 fire districts. I guarantee not all of them understand C1D1 and how to apply it to both hemp and marijuana. That's kind of an educational thing that we're working through. So maintaining temperature and humidity within ranges. If you have high humidity, it takes up space in the filter. With high humidity or with high temperature in a cultivation environment comes humidity. So keeping that HVAC system in check is going to also keep odors in check. Preventing solvent leaks is a big thing. Storage devices and equipment, this is something that we see as real common sense in other industries like auto body shops, things like that. These cannabis folks are new to dealing with solvents. They're new to dealing with air contaminants. A common practice that we have seen at cultivations is, so they'll have their tank of solvent. They do a couple of runs, get solvent recovery, but as I mentioned, those solvent runs are only about 70 to 80% recovery efficiency. So your feed tank is going down each time. Well, at a certain point, it's not going to be enough to do your next run, and you're going to have to pull a new tank or refill your current tank. common practice in the industry is just open that tank up and vent the rest of it out. God will take care of it. I don't know. And so, you know, we really want to highlight never dispose of a solvent through direct evaporation. That's not a proper disposal method. And again, common sense in other industries needs to be said in this one. Maintaining an inventory of all solvents and calculating annual air emissions. Again, something that's commonly done in all other manufacturing industrial industries, not being commonly done in this industry. We are working really hard to get all of our solvent extraction facilities, whether marijuana or, you know, or hemp extracting CBD, to get air quality permits. It's a long road to get them to calculate their air emissions and submit those permits, and it's very slow. So anything that you guys can do in your states to also get that ball moving, these extraction facilities will require air permits. It's very rare that they have emissions low enough to be exempt. All right, so that covers all the air stuff. You know, we talked about generators, we talked about VOCs from the plants, VOCs from extraction, hemp versus marijuana. So now we'll talk about energy, air, water, waste, just kind of touch on this stuff before I wrap up for you guys. So best practices for energy that we recommend: tracking and trending energy metrics. Again, very common in other industries, needs to be said in this industry. Having fans to circulate the airflow and create a uniform HVAC environment, pretty low energy cost, but really helps your HVAC system to prevent microclimates. Adjusting and staggering equipment scheduling to avoid peak demand. And so, you know, what we're really getting at with this is, you know, don't have your light cycle come on first thing in the morning during peak demand. You turn on all your rooms at the same time, all your lights at the same time, your irrigation equipment, all of that. Typically these facilities have multiple grow rooms, and so if we can get them on a staggered schedule, it really helps avoid those peak demand loads, which peak demand is associated with higher air emissions, because during times of peak demand, we are engaging less efficient power generating units that typically equate to more air emissions, and the end result for the consumer, in this case, the marijuana industry, is paying higher rates. So avoid those higher rates, avoid hitting those peak demand times. You're going to have a good environmental impact. Rolling benches and vertical farming, really what that's getting at is utilization of the light. So you have all these lights in this room, you know, basically supporting photosynthesis. You don't want any of that light to be wasted, because that's energy wasted, that's heat wasted, it's more load for your HVAC system to overcome. And so by having rolling benches, what that allows them to do is, normally where there'd be aisles for them to walk through to service the plants and water them and trim them and things like that, they're on rolling benches, so they can push all the plants really close together, so they're getting the most out of their light canopy. And then when they need to service the plants, they'll kind of part the seas where they need to get at them. Vertical farming is possible when the plants are younger, but once they're in the flowering stage, as you saw in the pictures, they get pretty tall. Like, they're as tall as I am. So vertical farming might be difficult to support once they're older, but when they're in that clone stage, like the first 6 weeks, you know, in the vegetative stage too, we have seen good advances in vertical farming, where you've got stacked racks of plants to better utilize the space. And then upgrading and optimizing HVAC systems. Here in Colorado, when we legalized indoors, Cannabis Cultivation's just rented out the warehouse space that was available in our state and the HVAC systems that come along with that. And so we have old pickle factories or t-shirt factories that are now converted to indoor cannabis cultivation, and they're still using the original HVAC system that was meant for managing temperatures for human comfort, not running at maximum capacity 24 hours a day to overcome the loads of an indoor cultivation, which, I mean, energy-wise, is the equivalent to a data center. I mean, these lights use a lot of energy. If you look back at that room that I showed you in the pictures, all of the lights hanging from the ceiling, each one of those lights is a 1,000-watt light bulb. 1,000 watts per light bulb that they're running, and they had tons of light bulbs in that room. A lot of energy, a lot of heat from that energy. So best practices for water. Again, tracking and trending water metrics, tracking environmental metrics, something that does not typically need to be said in other industries, but I'm going to say it again. For this industry, as outreach, environmental outreach coaches, we need to say it. They're not understanding it. Having precise and automated watering is really going to help. A typical practice in the cannabis industry is to overfeed the plants. In a hydroponic environment, the nutrients are delivered through the water. The nutrients are mixed in the water, and so a lot of times the impetus is to overwater, overgive the plants nutrients, and just wash the rest down the drain. We've seen up to 50% overwatering, so again, they're wasting nutrients, they're wasting water. The wastewater effluent is having to deal with those higher loads and removing all of that, and so if we can just be more precise about our nutrient dosing and our watering up front so we don't have as much runoff, we can alleviate a lot of those impacts. I touched on in-house water treatment a little bit at the beginning. Common as UV, ozone, and carbon filters. I'm fine with all those, doesn't really cause me heartburn. What I'm not fine with is reverse osmosis because it's 50% water to waste right off the bat. And again, here in Colorado, we have pretty good water quality, and so it's just like an unnecessary level of treatment. Also, that reverse osmosis is removing the natural nutrients that are already at low levels in our water, that then they just go back and add back in with their nutrient dosing. So it's just an inefficient process all around. If somebody is arguing that they have to have reverse osmosis as part of their process, I would argue that they need to do water testing to prove that need before they actually, go down that route. So a lot aren't testing their water quality; they're just over-treating to be safe. Best practices for plant waste. So there's a unique difference about hemp and marijuana here in Colorado. Plant waste from marijuana has to be mixed with 50% non-marijuana waste and rendered unusable and unrecognizable. So that picture on the side there is a picture of a grinder that's grinding up other types of organic waste, 50% non-marijuana waste with marijuana, so folks can't steal out of the dumpster to recover it. But what that causes on an from an environmental standpoint is we're doubling our landfill footprint every single time. It really makes composting difficult as well because these facilities are in the market of producing cannabis plants. They're not in the market of producing other organic waste streams. And so they have to find a supplement to mix 50% with their plant waste if they even want to consider composting. There's other barriers to composting in our state, but for the marijuana industry, that's the biggest one. We've seen the most sustainable option we've seen for plant waste is on-site bokashi fermentation. If you don't know what that is, it's basically just in a barrel. It's accelerating the time of composting on site in a barrel. We've seen that works well. We're also looking into anaerobic digestion of plant waste, but again, we're going to have to work through that 50-50 waste rule. But for hemp, their plant waste, there's no restrictions on what it can be used for. But it is worth noting that we have had a lot of folks want to recover the industrial fibers post CBD extraction for hemp, and that's not possible for two reasons. The plants grown for CBD extraction are typically, CBD is produced within the flowers of the plants, and so those hemp plants are going to be a different strain than industrial fiber hemp plants. So the hemp plants for CBD extraction are going to be more bushy, have bigger flowers. It's going to be concentrated on producing as much flower material as possible. Versus for industrial fiber, the fibers that are of value are going to be in the stalks and stems of the plant. So you're going to see long, stocky, thin, very few leaves on the natural fiber purposes. And also the first step in the CBD extraction process is to grind the plant down basically to a powder so that when the solvent comes into contact with the plant material, it has the most surface area possible to be able to absorb that CBD out of the plant. However, those fibers are now macerated to the point that you can't recycle them. They're they're not reusable fibers. So there is quite a bit of plant waste from CBD extraction in our state is what I'm getting at. At least they don't have to mix it with 50% non-plant waste, but there is a lot of plant waste, and there's an opportunity to try to figure out a better solution to all this plant waste. Disposing of solvent contaminated plant waste properly can be an issue, and so depending on how much solvent is contained in the plant waste at the end of the process, you know, some of them press it or centrifuge it to try to recover more, others just soak it and throw it away. And so the solvent content can really vary, and if it's high enough for it to be a hazardous waste, it has to be hauled away as hazardous waste. Here in Colorado, we don't have a flammable liquid hazardous waste incinerator, so all of our hazardous waste gets shipped to either Nebraska or Texas, 2 states that don't have legal marijuana. So there is this kind of floating unanswered question out there of, okay, well, if this plant waste has more than 0.3% THC content in it, it legally can't cross state lines, but yet it's mandated to do so to be disposed of properly as hazardous waste. That's an interesting conundrum. I don't have an answer to it. But yeah, interesting. So recovering of stalks and stems for industrial fiber applications, that is one exception to the marijuana 50-50 waste mixing rule. There's very little THC content in the stalks and stems, but high fiber content. So those stalks and stems can be diverted, exempt from the 50-50 waste rule if they're going to be used for industrial fiber applications. Basically, if the fibers are going to be recycled, we'll let them set aside stalks and stems for that purposes. So best practices for other waste streams that are worth mentioning. There's a lot of packaging waste from the industry. Every single product that goes out the door is in like 3 layers of plastic, small, not easily recycled plastic. And so we're really trying to address this packaging waste issue here in Colorado. We now allow our dispensaries to have take-back programs for packaging. So if you purchase a joint from a dispensary and it comes in a little plastic tube that's child-proof, you know, Washington is seeing this like wash up on their shores, all these, they call them doob tubes, constantly. It's a huge source of waste. They're too small to be captured in the filters of a recycling facility typically. And so we're now seeing the law allow take-back programs so people can keep their packaging waste, take it back to the dispensary, maybe get some rewards points or whatever for turning in their packaging again. The facility can sanitize it, relabel it, reuse it. We're happy with that. That's a good thing. Spent solvents become hazardous waste. Electronics and batteries, which they actually do have a lot of e-waste between the lighting, the ballast, you know, some of the smaller electronic equipment that they use. We do see a lot of e-waste and, like I said, mercury-containing light bulbs and ballasts that need to be disposed of properly. Worth noting that we are developing a free online tool for the cannabis industry to track and trend their environmental metrics on a voluntary basis and on an anonymous basis. There's a website, it's a draft, we're working through it, but the great thing is it's modeled after the Brewers Association tool that they put out for craft breweries to track their environmental metrics, so energy used, water used, waste generated, all normalized to pounds of cannabis produced. And then they can go into an anonymous sharing environment and look at how their metrics stack up to metrics of their peers. So are they top 25%? Are they bottom 25%? If they have dollars to invest, should they invest them in energy? Should they invest them in water? Kind of helping them see their blind spots as far as environmental impacts and efficiency goes. Hoping to build in some tools to help them track return on investments for sustainability projects. So they invest in LED lights and they're supposed to pay off in 5 years. They can track their utility bills, you know, and see, are we on track for that 5 years? Are we ahead of the curve? Are we behind? And how is our production being affected? Because if our production tanks, but our energy bill is lower, it kind of goes back to that ratio. Like, was that a good return on investment? Because now I'm making less product. So we hope to shine some light on that data analysis through this tool. So that's everything that I had for you guys that I was working on today. It looks like we've got about 10 minutes left for questions. Happy to take questions. We've got a lot of resources on the website there. Welcome to follow me on LinkedIn. You'll get sick of the air study articles. And yeah, welcome to call me or email me and talk to me on an individual basis as well. Colorado is doing a lot to coach other states who have legalized marijuana through kind of this environmental regulatory structure and what the impacts are. You know, working with other states to help them write their air permits, because we're the first state that I know of at least, I don't want to boldly speak there, but the first state that I know of that's actually air permitting these extraction facilities, whether it be hemp or marijuana. Again, same industrial process, closed loop solvent extraction, they need to be permitted. So that's kind of where things are at. Happy to help. You are on.
That was informative.
I learned a lot about marijuana growing. We just kind of reiterated some points that we had already thought. Growing is agriculture.
I've unmuted everyone, so if you have a question.
Yes, I have a question for Kaitlin Urso. This is Bob Mochi from the state of Michigan.
Go ahead.
Okay, Kaitlin, we have some, or there's some other people in the background. If you could mute your phones, because you're talking over the presentation.
I don't know. I think they're all in Washington.
So,
actually, no, there's one.
Kaitlin?
Washoe County.
Yeah, go ahead. I'll try to hear you over everyone.
In Clark.
You were talking about closed loop essential extraction.
Yeah, I think it's
and you said that they only has.
Do is try and get in touch with the Marijuana Commission.
I was wondering if you could more clearly define the losing solvent in the closed loop system.
Everything about marijuana.
Sure. So in this closed loop system, basically they've got pressurized vessels that they're filling with plant material. That's the first process. Then they seal off those pressurized, cylinders, tubes, whatever they are, and then they run the solvent through them to basically wash over the plant material. And then the marijuana extract or the hemp extract basically, settles to the bottom of the canister. It's going to be like a really thick molasses looking liquid, like black honey almost. And so that's going to settle to the bottom of the canister. And then they're going to go through a vacuuming process where they vacuum out all the solvent that's basically, left in that pressurized vessel. So they'll repressurize it, push all the solvent out. Then once that machine has recovered, vacuumed out as much solvent as it possibly can, they open up those pressurized vessels. And so you're going to get some VOC loss, some solvent loss from that, because the plant material is going to be soaked in solvent. Even though it's pressurized and there's some recovery, you've got solvent-laden plant material coming out of the machine. And then to that molasses material that comes out, that liquid commodity, that's kind of a raw crude there. It still has solvent retained in it. And then also there's a secondary extraction process typically where they need to separate out the fats and lipids from that first pass extraction. And to do that, they will mix that raw crude, is what they call it, with ethanol. So basically just pour Everclear, essentially, liquid ethanol, into it, mix it up, and then put it in the freezer for a certain amount of time. And that process is called winterization. Well, mixing it with ethanol and freezing it makes it so the fats and lipids will rise to the top. They can, cut that off as waste, and then they'll put it through a evaporation machine, which was that other glass extraction machine that I showed in the picture. And that will basically boil off any of the residual ethanol solvent and recover it and condense it. So in this picture here, that first bulb is underneath a heating element. That's where you would put the ethanol mixed with the crude. It heated up, then it'd send it through that condenser coil. You'd recover the ethanol solvent in the second bulb, and then you just have the leftover product in that first bulb. And so you're getting evaporative loss throughout the process. When you pull that raw crude out of the first pressurized vessel, you're going to get evaporative losses. When you open air, mix that with ethanol, you're getting evaporative losses. When you put that into the freezer and let it off gas for an hour or so as it freezes, you're getting evaporative losses. When you transfer that ethanol mixed with crude into the roto-evaporator to evaporate off that solvent and condense it, you're getting some evaporative losses there. So it's really just every step along the process, you're losing a little bit of air emissions each time.
So if I can ask you one quick question as a follow-up to your answer. The condenser on the rotovac, do you accept a standard control efficiency factor, or are you requiring monitoring as far as temperature of water inlet temperature and outlet temperature? And are you requiring them to demonstrate their control efficiency as they operated, or again, back to just a standard control factor?
Sure. So because a lot of this equipment is so specialized, and honestly, a lot of it is like one-off built specifically for the marijuana industry. We're seeing a lot of like home build manufacturers where maybe they build 5 pieces of equipment, that's all they've ever built, and so they're not really providing spec sheets and those types of things. And so in those, basically, we will divert to manufacturers, provide information. So, you know, if it's a standard rotovap that's been around forever, it's going to have, you know, standardized specs that the manufacturer can provide, that we will rely on those specs and just say, you know, if you're operating it according to the manual, we'll take these specs at face value. But now if it's more one of these sort of home-built one-off systems that don't have, you know, verified spec sheets that come with them, we will require them to do some sort of monitoring or testing to get us a recovery efficiency.
Yeah, I assume the control efficiency is going to vary with the vapor pressure of the solvent. So there's an additional concern I have as far as just accepting manufacturer specifications.
Well,
but I don't
we'll
want
only accept manufacturer specifications if it's rated for the solvent that they're using too.
Excellent. Excellent.
Yeah, so like the roto evaporation machines really only used with ethanol. I mean, you're not going to see roto evap with butane or propane, you know, because those are more gases. But you're right that the solvent does come into play. And so our permit engineers, kind of as we work through each one of these facilities, we just, you know, we really have it be an open dialogue with our permit engineers. We tell the facilities, submit as much information as possible about your equipment, include pictures, include any specifications. We also ask them that they submit any standard operating procedures that they have to support how they use the machine. And then our engineers kind of dig into the permit from there.
Okay, very helpful. I'd like to give everybody else an opportunity to talk. I'm going to mute myself.
Sure, and just so you know too, I have spoke with the folks that, you know, the Michigan air permitting folks. You guys have your first few applications in the door from the marijuana industry, and I have been working with your air permitting team in Michigan to provide them examples of Colorado permits, kind of walk them through this specialized process.
Yeah, we'll be conducting an inspection on Thursday of one facility just to to gain the knowledge we need to make an informed decision on writing a permit.
Fantastic. That will really help. It makes the process really come to life.
And I'm sure we'll be calling on your knowledge base to help us out with that. So I'm going to mute now. Thank you.
Sure. Sounds good.
Kaitlin,
Hey, go ahead, Linnell.
This is Linnell. We did have, Mark, we did have like 3 questions on the chat. So
Okay.
I'll go ahead and ask those for those folks. Jeremy Hancher wanted to know, Kaitlin, does your agency receive odor complaints from this industry similar to any other industry getting an odor complaint? And if so, does the complaint get handled any differently?
Absolutely. We get odor complaints all the time. And absolutely, they're handled a little bit differently because through our experience and responding to odor complaints from the hemp and marijuana industries, we have found that our state level odor ordinance is not stringent enough to cause violations. And so, you know, we will coach a facility through what they can do best management practices wise to reduce their odors. But unfortunately, our statewide odor ordinance is not stringent enough to cause violations from the marijuana industry. Our statewide odor ordinance is a 7-to-1 ratio, so 7 parts of clean air to 1 part of contaminated air. Can you smell it? And what we found is marijuana is not strong enough to cause those types of violations. And so a lot of times we're just left sort of letting them know the consequences.
Okay,
I've got,
oh, you've got to get off.
can you guys do me a solid? I'm getting kicked out of my room, but I can call right back in and take more questions. I just have to give up the room that I'm in.
Mark, do you want to maybe just email the questions, the remaining questions to Kaitlin
Yeah,
and let her
we could
answer?
do that.
Happy to do that too. It's up to you guys. I'm happy to call back in if you'd like.
I'm okay with that, but if we can't do that, then I guess the next best would be email questions.
Okay. Well, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and log off.
Hey, anyone there?
I think she logged
Oh,
off.
you got Bob Omuchi, but yeah, it looks like Kaitlin logged off.
Yeah, somebody was knocking on the door wanting to kick her out of her room. I'm going to email those questions to you.
Yeah, and so I don't know if you were able to get a copy of her presentation.
Yeah, I have it.
And then I don't know if you were able to record this.
Yep,